you for joining us. We are going to start tonight's program with a documentary that I made between 2018 and 2020. The actual documentary was filmed during the summer session at NYO Canada with 5 members of the percussion section from the 2018 NYO Canada Orchestra, plus 4 visitors. And then I have a collaborator, Preston Beebe. So we edited the film together. It finished during the pandemic. So this was a very large project that took many parts and different partners, including Soul Percussion, Nexus, Russell Hartenberger especially, and myself, and a bunch of us worked together between 2017 and 2020 to put this large project together. You can see the whole project on drummingat50.com, and it's divided into multiple sections. The main page has 2 films. One is the one we will watch today, Drumming in Magic Time, featuring Russell Hartenberger. It's about his oral teaching of the piece and how I wanted to document this process for future generations of percussionists. Then there are other sections to this website, including papers and podcasts and articles. So I suggest that for those of you who are interested in Steve Reich's music, in particular the piece Drumming, to take some time to explore the resources here. Okay, thank you.
Follow me for now. Okay. You know, this piece is based on repetition, but it's also based on timbre differences. So a lot of this, you know, we'll get into soft sticks at a certain point, but a lot of it is timbral difference. So part of the subtle timbral difference is one person playing, then another person duplicating the same part in unison, but just because of the fact that 2 people are playing, it creates a little different texture. So these changes should not happen simultaneously. Gradual process is the key. So whoever starts, then the other one waits 2 or 3 repetitions. The only thing is try not to be consistent, like don't always wait 2 or don't always wait 4 or something. So just so it's a little bit random in that sense. The other thing is attack placement. So attack placement is particularly important in this. You can think of it as a time signature so that there's some kind of regularity to the placement, so it sounds very clear, especially at the beginning, because you're establishing the foundation for an hour-long piece. So it helps if it's really distinct. Got it? Okay, so then, Matt, you're going to do some resultant patterns. Generally speaking, resultant patterns are fragments of what you guys are doing. It's tricky sometimes since the drums are situated in this odd configuration. You can't think like you normally do in a keyboard setup or any other normal percussion setup. So it's strange, and also they kind of mirror each other. So it's doubly confusing. With each resultant pattern, the idea is that you creep into the texture and you kind of reach the level that they are, maybe ever so slightly louder, but it's not meant to be soloistic. The idea is that you bring to the listener's attention piece or a fragment of the composite pattern, and then fade back out, and then the next one in and out. So it's kind of this wavy feeling, okay? A good idea is to figure out ones you want to play. I mean, I know one of the ideas is you can make them up as you go along, but Jim Price, who's the percussionist in the original Reich Ensemble, who would make them up on the spot. I mean, he discussed with Steve, they would listen to tapes and try to come up with some patterns, but then he would just, on the spot, decide what to play. But then he said the playing of the other two people was so strong that he felt like he needed to play equally as strong, and he could do that more if he knew exactly what he was going to play. Pick out some ones that are interesting and that you feel comfortable with, and so you can play them strongly. So that pattern that I had you change, the reason I like that is because that's one Steve always did. It was one of his favorite ones, so I just might as well. Dig it up, bum bum. Dig it up, bum bum. Think of it as a 4-cycle phrase, with the fourth one being only half as much, or I think you broke it up two-cycle phrase or something. That's okay, or you can do some of both. You can do a 2-cycle for a few times and then expand it to a 4-cycle and then back to a 2-cycle. In Steve Reich's music, drumming and music for 18 musicians and a lot of other pieces, arch form is very important. So arch form and even little things like this, like small arches within big arches. So little things like that are really good to do. So people who are doing resultant patterns, if you can think of a pattern that can expand and contract, that's good. If you can, once or twice, come up with one that's digga-digga-da, 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 da-da, digga-da, digga-digga-da, da-da, 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 digga-digga-da, or something like that, you know. So the next thing happens when you reach those 3 notes, you fade out and go around to the other side of the drums and turn your sticks over and give him a visual cue and come in with the same part but with soft sticks. So the only other change is that you change your sticking. And then after he does that, you're out. So you come around to this side, change your sticks, and come in with him in unison. I can say what Bob Becker does, who plays that part when I play your part, he pushes slightly, which provides more resistance for the person phasing. So instead of him going like this, it's kind of like this. So it helps actually the person phasing when, like you're pushing, but the other person's also slightly pushing, but maybe not as quite as much. When they've both built up the pattern with soft sticks, then you come over and play in unison with Pino. You fade in, and when he's in, then you fade out. Okay? And once he's up to your level, then you phase. Welcome back. Now, Young is going to assist in everybody switching their sticks back to hard sticks. So once you're in those relative positions, 1, 5, and 3, Young is going to double your part. She's going to fade in with soft sticks, playing your part. You do a crossfade, you fade out when she's in, turn your sticks over to hard sticks and come back in the exact same pattern. Just a matter of going from soft to hard. It's a way of doing that. She'll do it first for you, then for Pino, then for Matt. First, Pino changes. I think the thing is, once everybody gets the C sharps in, then try to balance the level of the C sharps. So it makes an interesting rhythmic combination. And the next thing that happens, so the right hand goes to all C sharp, or the middle hand, right or left, whichever one you're playing, goes to middle C sharps. The other hand skips over that drum. So you're playing. At the time of when Reich was writing this, a lot of us were studying non-Western music, African music and Indian music, and Steve Reich wrote this piece right after coming back from Africa and studying Ghanaian drumming. So there are a lot of relationships you can draw in the rhythmic configurations and the way to listen to African drumming. So some of us who were doing that at the time kind of picked up on it maybe more easily than some other people. When Steve was getting percussionists to play in the ensemble, he would bring in people. We had weekly rehearsals, and he'd bring in some of the really best freelance percussionists in New York City. I mean, they're really great players, and some of them couldn't get this just because it was different. They hadn't had any experience with anything like it, and they just couldn't figure out what was going on. So they didn't continue. This is the beginning of the transition from the bongos to the marimbas. Once you hear the marimbas enter, it'll take them a while because they'll walk up to the marimbas. So you'll be playing the soft interlocking pattern for some time while they come in, and they'll do a gradual fade in. Once you hear the marimbas at a fairly audible level, pretty like forte or strong level, then you can start the diminuendo. So it's nice to have a really slow crossfade because you've been playing this for 15 minutes or more, and the change in sound is really, really beautiful. One of the most important things to be aware of in this piece is that you can hear the pattern in so many different ways. Basically, there are 12 different units or eighth notes that could be divided in various ways. And this adds interest to the piece, but it also can be confusing to the listener or to the performer. So if you're performing drumming, you should always know where your part is in relation to the person who's playing one. And in this case, one is being played by Josh. We count it in a pattern of 6. So play your pattern, Josh. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay? There will be a phase into unison with Josh, and then you two fade out. So you'll be left playing by yourself. So when you come in strong like that and match Josh's dynamic. You know, the idea about phasing is to try to extend it, make it kind of long, but it's very, a very incremental type of pushing forward. Start a little bit farther back, and then linger when you get to the close to the mic, and then back off. So each one should be 3 times as long as you just did. The last one isn't really synced. Do that one again. Okay, so I think once you rush. So you don't need to do it as fast as you think you need to do it. So there's a tendency to push it a little bit. It can be handed back and forth. And also with each one of them, the beginning part of the phrase of each one is getting better. The tail off needs to be a little bit longer. Steve Reich is a microphone junkie, self-proclaimed, and he mics everything and have someone mix it at the board. In this case, it's a smaller auditorium, so we're not having everything mic'd. So we'll have to balance acoustically. So that means people on the back marimba will actually probably have to play a little bit stronger. So one thing, when you're phasing, it might be a good idea to play a little bit less until you're locked in. Then you can hear the relationship. If you're playing too loud, it's a little bit harder to hear the relationship to these guys. So you can keep it a little bit under. Once you're there, then just lock in at an equal dynamic. When you're playing interlocking patterns, there's different ways you can try to keep together, especially if your distances apart. One, of course, is just to hear the relationship 5 and 3. The other thing is pick out a note. In this case, the G sharp kind of sticks out, at least to my ear, so you can hear dum, 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 dum. everything in this piece actually is very gradual. There's no hurry to do anything. The original performances and the original recording were about an hour and 20 minutes long. Nowadays, performances tend to be in the 55-minute area, so things have gotten faster. But back in the 70s, people were not in a hurry to do things. It was a different time. I was a graduate student at Wesleyan University in Connecticut in 1970 and 1971. I just started my doctoral program. And Wesleyan had a world music program. It was kind of ethnomusicology department, but they called it world music. And they had African drumming. There was an African drummer there from Ghana whose name was Abraham Adzinya. And he had only been there for a year, so he was just getting used to teaching Western musicians how to play African drumming. But I was really taken with this course. I really got into the music, and I wanted to find out more about it. And I thought the best thing to do would be to go to Ghana in the summer of 1971 during the break between first and second year of grad school. But I had no idea how to do that. Back in those days, it wasn't common for people from Canada and the United States to go to Ghana to study. Now there are lots of programs to do that, but then there weren't any that I knew of. And I had no idea what to do. And I happened to mention it to a fellow graduate student, a friend of mine named Richard Teitelbaum. Richard was also studying African drumming, but he was a composer, and he was from New York City. And he was very familiar with the kind of the underground new music scene in New York. And I mentioned to Richard that I wanted to go to Ghana, but I didn't know anything about doing it. And he said, well, it just so happens that I have a friend who did it last summer, the summer of 1970. And he was a composer. His name is Steve Reich. He went to Ghana in the summer of 1970. And when he came back, he began writing a piece, and he's writing it now. And it's a piece for percussion, but he doesn't know any percussionists. So he said, why don't I get you two guys together, and Steve can tell you about his experiences in Ghana and how he went about studying drumming over there. And he can tell you also about the piece he was writing. So we met in New York City, and Steve told me about what shots to get and where he stayed and all kinds of things about what to do when I got there, how to study with drummers and those kinds of things. And he also said he was writing this piece, and he invited me to a rehearsal. So I thought that would be interesting to do. I'd never heard of Steve Reich and didn't know anything about it, but I thought I'd check it out. So I went to his loft for a rehearsal I think it was probably a Tuesday night in early spring of 1971. He lived on Broadway near Canal Street in an area of New York City called Soho, which was kind of an artist's area at the time. And he was just rehearsing the bongo section of drumming. He was writing it and rehearsing it, and just beginning to write the marimba section of drumming. People who were playing it were Steve, who had training as a drummer, and a man named John Gibson, who was a flute, saxophone, reed player, and two pianists, Steve Chambers and Arthur Murphy. So they were playing the bongo section of drumming, and it was kind of interesting, and we started doing the marimba section. But I found the whole concept really intriguing, so I decided I would keep coming to rehearsals, which I did. So the way we learned drumming was Steve wrote it as we rehearsed it. So we would go in for our weekly rehearsal, and he would demonstrate the parts that he wrote during the week. He didn't show us any notation, but he was a percussionist, so he could play all the bongo parts, and then he could play the marimba parts after he started writing that. And he would play a part, and we would imitate it and repeat it until we got it, and then attach it to the part we'd learned the week before. So that's the way we learned the whole piece. He recorded every rehearsal, and then during the week he would compose compose the next part of the piece. And this took place over the next several months. Well, early spring of 1971 and the premieres in December of 1971, we had about 75 rehearsals for drumming, but we all memorized it. The singers read music and the piccolo player read music, but all the percussionists or all the people who were playing percussion instruments just memorized it. We found that was a really terrific way to learn the piece. It was also the way I was learning African drumming and some of the other kinds of non-Western music. Steve has said many times that going to Ghana, which he did in 1970, did not sort of change his whole concept of composing, but it confirmed some of the ideas that he already had. So he had already thought about composing with rhythm as a really substantial part of his compositional structure. But going to Ghana confirmed the fact that you could use rhythm as a basic compositional tool, and that also percussion could be the central voice in an ensemble rather than, say, strings in a symphony orchestra, as was more common in Western music at the time. So it's sort of confirmed all these ideas. For me, it was a great kind of way to make a transition from being an orchestral percussionist, which I had trained to do up to that point. One who's interested in chamber music and world music and all the other kinds of things that I got into eventually, rather than pursuing a career in orchestral music. I saw a lot of the connections with African music, which was great. Drumming is based on this one basic pattern, as you all know, and a lot of African drumming is based on patterns, very simple patterns, just like that, and put together in some complex way that makes for an interesting piece of music. Now, it was kind of interesting to me. I actually interviewed Steve a couple of times in the past few years to ask him about his interest in rhythm and the use of rhythm in his compositions. And he had some interesting things to say. One was that he started playing drums when he was about 14, I guess, as a teenager, when he discovered not only things like Stravinsky, Rite of Spring, but also jazz. He got very interested in jazz and heard John Coltrane and Miles Davis and the drummer Kenny Clark. Any of you heard of Kenny Clark? He's not the most famous jazz drummer, but he was a very innovative jazz drummer. He's the guy who really started the right cymbal pattern. Before that, drum set players were playing sort of a steady pattern, steady beat on bass drum and playing off beats and different things on the right cymbal. But Kenny Clark switched his right hand over to right cymbal and started playing the right pattern and didn't play steady beats on the bass drum, so that there was a more fluid feel to his time. And that's what really appealed to Steve Reich, this kind of, he calls it a sense of magic time, this real floating feeling. So the pattern you play is in the transition from the marimba section to the glockenspiel section, the Glock players should line up rhythmically with the marimba players. All the Glock players play from the back side of the glockenspiels, not the normal playing side. So the glockenspiel players fade in using the blue rubber mallets, which are hard rubber, and fade in gradually. The middle glockenspiel player should line up rhythmically with the middle marimba player on beat 1. The downstage glockenspiel player should line up with the downstage marimba player on beat 6, and the upstage glockenspiel player should line up rhythmically with the upstage marimba player on beat 5. Once they're in and made the crescendo, then they phase into unison and move to the next part. Kevin moves to this glockenspiel with hard sticks, wood sticks. Josh to this clock on the other side with wood mallets. Then I'll show you your pattern. And you guys come in together. So maybe Josh, you give a cue, and when you come in strong. So as soon as they come in, then you start fading out gradually. And the next thing is Bryn, fade out, come around with hard sticks. And you play this Glock, the same pattern that Josh is. Okay, so once he's faded, then Pino, you come to this clock and you play the same pattern. Okay, so you play that for a little bit, and then when you're ready, you change your pattern completely. Okay. So you're playing. Change this. So then there's whistling. You won't have to project so much, but you also won't have to create crescendo diminuendo yourself. You can just move in and out of the mic, go into it and work your way off it, and it'll just create the dynamic. It's actually better than you trying to do it, because oftentimes when you change dynamic in whistling, you change pitch. So if you can just get a solid pitch at a comfortable dynamic, then you can just control the crescendo diminuendo. After you're finished, then you have a seat, and that's the indication for them to move on to the next thing. Does everybody know who Glenn Velez is? He's kind of famous in our world. He was in in early Steve Reich group, played drumming, and he played, I think he played your part. He played the slow glockenspiel part. So Glenn was, before he got into hand drums, he was basically a marimba player. He studied at Manhattan School of Music with Jim Price and played marimba. But I don't know if you've seen Glenn play frame drums, but he kind of bends his head to the side. I don't know. He kind of turns it this way and he plays, or sometimes it's this way. But he rarely plays with his head straight on. And he played marimba that same way too. And he played, in Steve Reich's group, he played everything with his head kind of off to the side. So it never looked like he was actually looking at the keyboard. He would play this, and he was such a loose guy. He was a very relaxed guy. Every so often he'd drop his mallet, but he had this knack of it bouncing right back up into his hands. He rarely missed a note, so he'd play like... It's important to be in contact with the piccolo player. So they'll point out to her that your left hand is always going to be one. So what often we have to do is that you have to nod. We're used to watching mallets. She might not be used to watching mallets. So you and just look at her. Just give a really direct, explicit nod on one. And she might look at you more than once, because she's got a pattern that she stops and has a different pattern. So until she gets used to it, she may want more help. Okay, good. That's perfect. Now, except for, it should be a little bit more legato. Da, 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 da. It's not written that way, but he meant it to be that way. Da, 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 da. Just a little bit more connected. It's getting more rounded, which is good. The one note that kind of sticks out is the high note. Da, da, da. If you can go da, 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 instead of da, you're kind of ending da, 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 a little too abruptly. Da, 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 da. Almost like it's a longer note, although it's not. You just land on it like it's a longer note. And the same here. Da da da, ba da 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 da, da 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 da, da. Like not, don't dive into that one quite so much.
Okay.
Steve Reich often says that he wished he could get T-shirts for everybody in the groups that play his music, and that says "Sempre tenuto." He likes his rhythmic passages to be played not too staccato, and as he puts it, like people with their shoes too tight, but a little bit more tenuto. So just think of it that way. It's sort of almost legato, da 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 da. He also had this habit of disappearing when we would all go to dinner. Just became, I don't know, more extreme than ever. We were on a tour in Australia, and we were taking a bus tour up the Gold Coast of Australia, and we left one day from a hotel, and there was a check to make sure everybody was on the bus, everybody was there, and we started driving a few miles down the street, and somebody said, "Where's Glenn?" And we looked around, and Glenn wasn't on the bus. He had been on the bus with the head count, and then all of a sudden he wasn't on the bus. And we said, "Better pull over, we got to get Glenn." So the bus pulled over, and about that time, a hotel car with Glenn came up. Somehow he had gotten off the bus, and the hotel drove him up to meet the bus. Kevin, this is your big moment. You get to change your patterns. Once they've faded out, you can just wait a couple of repetitions. Doesn't have to be long. But when you make the change, make it really strong. That's a nice change that happens, and it precipitates other stuff that has to happen afterwards. With all the ringing and everything, sometimes you kind of get lost in the textures. You'll make your change, and then after you've made your change, then you play this pattern. Once he's changed, you fade in with that pattern. You fade. You know, you guys are all playing really well. Sometimes I get the feeling you're not creating enough center to your sound, even on glockenspiel. So I think that has to do with finger control. So every time you play a note, somehow it's got to have. Sometimes if it's too light, it doesn't have the carrying power. And actually, if you can play like that, it'll make it easier for the piccolo player to match that sound. If it's kind of a superficial sound, then it's harder for her to create an equal kind of timbre or quality of sound. But I think in general, I think that's something that all percussionists should work on, is to try to get a really centered, focused sound that has projection. Now, the best example of that is one I use, but I can't think of a better example than Bob Becker on xylophone. So xylophone is roughly the equivalent to glockenspiel in that one might think that you can't create a variety of articulation on a xylophone, but Bob can. So your homework is to go watch him on YouTube playing a ragtime piece. So if you notice, his hands rarely get higher than this. even though he's playing at Mach 10 all over the keyboard. But most people just get, I don't know, taken away with his technique, is the fact that he can play so many notes and think up so many patterns to play and so much improvisation, such beautiful kind of combinations of things. But the thing that impresses me is the sound he can get on the xylophone. I've never heard anybody play xylophone with that kind of sound. And he's doing that because he's getting a real centered, focused sound on every note he plays equally without a lot of upstroke. He plays with upstroke, but upstroke can be more than a motion of the stick. Upstroke is really a concept. The other thing that Steve said in my interviews with him is that when he was a student, when he was taking drum lessons, he studied with a man named Roland Koloff. There's two books that Roland Koloff gave Steve Reich to work on snare drum. One was Haskell-Harr snare drum method, which is how I started. A lot of you may have, although there are a lot of other books now that percussionists use. And the second one was the George Lawrence Stone stick control, which I think we all know. Some of us have worked in that. And still really one of the basic fundamental snare drum method books that most teachers use today. So Steve said that for some reason he was fascinated by the stick control book. All it is the first few pages are just eighth notes with every permutation of right and left hand combinations. But he said instead of finding that boring, he found it really interesting. And he said he didn't realize at the time how that interest in patterns would appear later in his compositions. Now the fun begins.
I was having fun.
I just hear it as a rhythmic pattern, devoid or separated from the normal drumming pattern. Okay, so we're going to start with the build-up into the last section. So we add one note at a time, and it's always marimba, bongos, clap, marimba, plum, until the whole pattern is built up. We'll just start, and then I'll show you the notes one at a time. So I'm going to be walking around a lot. It's helped me a lot in concentration by doing this. So what I've learned is that the first thing I've got to do is take care of myself. It's like when the airplane's about to crash, you're supposed to put the mask on yourself first before helping everybody else. The first thing I have to do in this and in African drumming is get my part together, know where, be able to play my part, and then sort of expand my awareness to other parts. The part next to me, all my instruments are playing, whatever else is happening around me. And I think that's critical in any kind of playing you do. You got to get your own little thing together first so that your muscle memory is intact and your mind knows what you're having to do. So that in the case of drumming, Steve Reich's music, at a certain point, if you have that kind of security, then you can start wandering a little bit. Your mind can wander, as long as you check in every so often. Beginning with something like piano phase or marimba phase. A lot of us have played marimba phase where da 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 da. One hand is going like this, one hand is going back and forth like this, so it's sort of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, ba da ba da ba da ba da ba da ba da. So that kind of thing. And if you look in his notebooks from the 1960s and 70s, you see instead of writing notes, eighth notes and eighth rests, he'll write R, L, R, L, or R, R, L. So he's thinking about hand distribution back then. It was his 70th birthday. We were on tour in Europe, and we had a big party for him in a restaurant, and I gave a toast and said it was really great. And I mentioned the fact that I didn't think at the time when I was staying overnight at his loft in New York City and after rehearsals and getting up in the morning and doing yoga with him, I didn't realize at the time that he was going to become really famous composer. And he said, I didn't realize that either.